only say it's Penguin.
What should we say?
It's
I won't
Columbia.
say any.
It's Columbia
Oh,
University Press and Penguin Random House.
Good evening. Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet presents Rochona Majumdar in conversation with Malavika Banerjee on her book Art, Cinema and India's Forgotten Futures. In this book, the author examines key works of Indian art cinema to demonstrate how film emerged as a mode of doing history, and that, in so doing, it anticipated some of the most influential insights of post colonial thought. Rochana Majumdar is a historian of modern India. Her interests span histories of Indian cinema, gender, and marriage in colonial India, and Indian intellectual thought in the 19th and 20th centuries. She is an associate professor of cinema and media studies, South Asian languages, and civilizations at the University of Chicago. Today, she will be in conversation with Malavika Banerjee. Malavika Banerjee has a deep interest in films and, of course, books. She's the director of Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet. On behalf of all of us here at Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet, let the session begin. Mala?
thank you, Shukonna, and welcome, Rochona. Before I start the session, thank you so much for entrusting with us this webinar, which is possibly the first one you're having in India on this wonderful book. I would request you to hold up the book so that people can see it. It's got a beautiful cover, which we'll ask Rochona about in a little bit. And please do catch this book. It's a Penguin Random House and Columbia Press uh, publication. And truly, for anybody who is interested in cinema, it is a wonderful insight into a period of Indian cinema and into an aspect of Indian cinema that is rarely written about as a book. At least we do see the odd article, but a wonderful book like this is really a treat for someone like me. First disclaimer, I'm not a film critic, I'm not a film expert, but I'm a person who enjoys cinema, and a lot of the books or cinema that's mentioned in this book reminded me of the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, where we engaged with cinema of this kind before the multiplex and later OTT world took us over. So let us start, Rochana, with the title. I'd said that, the title of the book, Art, Cinema, and India's Forgotten Futures, Film and History in the Post-Colony. So if you could just talk us through what made you use the term forgotten futures.
Mala, I shall do that, but first let me thank you for having me in this forum. I wish it was actually at the Victoria Memorial. Uh, this is not just the first event that I'm doing in India, it's actually the first event on the book. And the reason why it's particularly significant is because it had been my intention to actually hand the book over to a few near and dear ones, of which one is my mother, who I hope is actually watching this session today. But because of the pandemic, I haven't been able to travel to India. I hope to very soon. And one of the things I had promised myself was that when I do start speaking about the book, I wanted to start. I wanted to start it in India. Just because this book is about Indian cinema, it's also it's about my city, Kolkata, and that's why it's particularly significant that this book sort of goes into the world. I mean, it has been in the world for about a month now. That it's the first conversation that I'm having about it is with a Kolkata forum. Now, the title of the book, in a way, the the idea of forgotten futures is it's actually my tribute to what is referred to as the new film history that was pioneered in my department, Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Chicago. Now, very briefly, that film history, the new film history, questions a linear development of cinema where you had the Lumiere films or the Méliès films first, and that was a kind of cinema of the primitives. And then gradually you had the development into feature films, into Hollywood, into sound, the talkie comes. And then gradually you have video and all the rest, like digital and so on and so forth. What three pioneers, Miriam Hansen, Tom Gunning, and Yuri Sivian, did here was to argue that the history of cinema is not linear and that we need to look back to the past of cinema in order to see in it the futures that were forgotten. So, in some ways, they argue that what we are seeing in cinema now, these things were anticipated in the past of cinema. So, they were talking about forgotten film futures. Now, I take that idea. Tom Gunning actually has an article called Animated Pictures, Cinema's Forgotten or Film's Forgotten Futures. I take that idea and I argue that it's not just about the medium, but it's also about cinema's capacity to tell us about histories of the nation, of the post colonial nation that we have forgotten. And that's why I return to particular films and particular filmmakers as history makers, really, and how they delineated their own presence and the pasts that had led to those presents, and therefore given us certain intimations of futures that could be possible. I mean, I remember going back and forth with my editor about whether it should be possible futures or forgotten futures. And then I settled with forgotten because I think we need to go back to those pasts to see the imaginations of the future that were buried in those pasts that we have forgotten.
Yes. So in this part of what you say is the time when the new India, post-colonial India, was trying to find its feet to the optimism of a new future, as well as the disorienting factors like the aftermath of the famine, partition. So, in this period, there is also a sense of self consciousness about these filmmakers trying to define themselves. So, all of them are trying to speak about what is new wave cinema, where does it start, what are the films that actually mark a break from the mainstream cinema. You've mentioned Munna, Chinnamul, and Pothet Panchali as those films. So, this constant regarding, self conscious desire to kind of locate themselves in the narrative of a post independence India. Can you just talk us through those fascinating parts of your book?
That's a really good question. So one of the things that I try to that I argue in the book is that in 47, when independence comes, obviously there's a great deal of excitement about it. I mean, after a long 200 years or 200 plus years of colonial rule, you have decolonization, and there's certain excitement that goes with it. Now, India never had a state-sponsored cinema, unlike
Yes.
certain West European countries did after the Second World War. But nevertheless, both in the major filmmaking centers of Bombay, Madras, and they used to be called Bombay, Madras, Calcutta in those years, as well as in the group of filmmakers that I speak about who are not affiliated with those mainstream industries, there is tremendous excitement about participating in the project of nation making. So I say in the book that in these early years, good citizens go together with the project of, or good films have something to contribute to the project of good citizen making. And there is a kind of, I mean, in different degrees, there is enthusiasm about the project of building a new nation state, and I think their film participates in that enthusiasm with the other arts, even though the state never really recognized cinema. But very quickly, certainly for the filmmakers that I discuss in this book, the promises of Nehruvian development and modernization begin to wear out. And that's where a bifurcation, I would argue, happens between this project of good citizen making and good filmmaking. Then filmmaking is just its own thing. And if anything, the task of filmmaking becomes to reflect on the various problems of the nation state, the various promises that have been broken, the paths not taken, and so on and so forth. And what I propose in the book is that much before academics, social scientists, historians began their critique of the developmental state, it's actually people in the arts, and I'm concerned here with these filmmakers, who anticipated, not just anticipated, but expressed those concerns. And that's why the decade of the 60s and early 70s is so important to me, which is when they were reflecting on, well, where did we come from and what is this present and where do we go. But initially, the project of art cinema actually began because it was part of the enthusiasm to build up the post colony from ground up.
The other part of this chapter of the book that is very interesting is the way certain individuals actually take it upon themselves. It's also an educating mission. It's a mission to educate and to show Indians across the country, the length and breadth, across beyond the metropolitans, not just across from one to the other, that there exists another kind of cinema. So one character that who really made me, who I was really drawn to, was Mari Satan. So I hope that's the way you pronounce her name. So if you can just talk me and the audience through how people like Mari Satan actually came with this mission, for lack of a better word, to show India there was an alternative, there was something beyond what was considered commercial cinema. We'll come to whether that term was pejorative later, but somebody like Mari Satan, what was her contribution and presence in India at that time all about?
Again, this is such a great question. And, one of the things that I want to foreground here is that even though this is the moment of decolonization, you would think that, oh, this is not a time that you would want a foreigner to come in and tell us what is good cinema. But I think in some ways it actually also speaks to a certain confidence and openness about 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 sort of inviting people who you think don't share in the colonial politics, but kind of opening up India to the world. And Seaton is among many such figures that actually visited India during this time. And she, in fact, famously once said that I will not set foot in India until the country is decolonized. So she initially came to write a biography of Jawaharlal Nehru. And she had links with Indians, as I document in the book. She'd been friends with
V.K.
Menon,
Krishna.
Krishna Menon, and with D.G. Tendulkar, and she introduced Tendulkar to Eisenstein. And Seaton was also one of Eisenstein's early biographers. She also took footage from his last film, Que Viva Mexico, and made a film of her own, A Time in the Sun. And she was a strange woman. And in fact, it's particularly interesting to me that before she went to India, she actually came to Chicago because she was married to a Chicago labor lawyer. And she showed many of the same films that she brought with her to India in our film society here. I'm pointing in this direction because it's actually two blocks out from us, Doc Films. So she comes and and she's welcomed. I mean, she's welcomed by a lot of people, and not just. I mentioned how much she liked Ray, but there were some other very, very important figures on whom more work needs to be done. One of them was Satish Bahadur, who actually started the Agra Film Society and then became a very important figure in the Film and Television Institute. And there was a kind of cinephilia in many parts of the country, and I write about it there. It's not just Kolkata, Bombay, Madras, but also places like, them small towns, Roorkee, Agra, Patna, Jaipur, Jodhpur. And there were film societies in all of these places. And of course, the bastion was Kerala. And Seaton traveled through the length and breadth of the country and helped develop what we called, actually, I think when you and I were growing up, we called it film appreciation. Itrobani was one place that used to have
Yes.
classes of film appreciation. Gaston Robesch was the person who ran it. Shomi Kondapadhyay. There were many people associated with it. So, in a sense, people like Seaton, who I describe as a film missionary, their contribution was to promote serious discussion about films before film studies as an academic discipline came into being. And that happened in India pretty late in 1993, with Jadavpur being the first department. But their thing was film is not a fallen art. It's something that should be up there with the other arts. And you could argue today that, oh, that's a very conservative stand, but be that as it may. And therefore, we should have serious discussions about films. And so, in other words, so in some ways, this idea of art cinema, film as an art, she is one of the early people to bring it to lots of people in the country. I mean, does that get to
Yes, it
what we
does. It does. It does. And, there are other interesting characters who again come into the book later. But if I'm just going from chapter to chapter, the other fascinating part, as I mentioned, there's this constant desire to, have a chronology that this is the first moment of new wave cinema. This is the first moment of alternative kind of cinema. So one watershed moment most film critics have converged on is the 1969 triumvirate of films Uski Roti, Bhuvan Shom, and Sara Akash, by Mani Kaul, Mrinal Sen, and Basu Chatterjee, respectively, and how that moment was viewed by Shotajit Rai and the conversations, the criticisms, the dismissals of that period. If you can just give us a flavor of, it's almost like this, this cauldron of opinion and, criticism, as I said, and everybody taking a different take and, before coming to
right.
terms with this moment. Yes.
So,
So if you could just,
again, let me say a few things about that moment because I mean, again, this is my feeling that that kind of passionate argument about cinema, where films are things to live and die for, and and you express that in print because there were so many arguments, as you rightly point out. I mean, and that's what I document in the book. I don't know that that moment has repeated itself in the history of Indian cinema. But to just back up a little, so I use the category art cinema in the book, and I say that the category arrives and consolidates itself in the 50s, right? Pothe Pachali is a very important moment. Then there are these really extraordinary films that that are made in the early 60s. But then the interesting thing, and this is what got me to the new wave, not so much that those three films were made. Sure, that's significant. But what got me to the new wave was that it seemed like just as the category art cinema was consolidating itself, it was also splintering. And there were a a very large number of words that were kind of being thrown out fast and loose. So, new cinema, new wave, political cinema, radical cinema, middle cinema, um, the avant garde. Um, Chidananda Dashgupta, whose centenary this is, he even came up with the category unpopular cinema because a bunch of films that were not doing well in the box office, but really they were the intellectual cinema. And as a historian, what struck me was when you have so many names for the same body of works, that tells you that, something, there's a churning that's going on. And when people are so concerned, we say, what's in a name? A lot. And for these people, I mean, how do you name this object of analysis? That was super important. And that's what the Indian New Wave was. It was, of course, these films, but it was also this kind of reflexivity about what constitutes not just a good film, but a radical film, a politically important film, a film that's experimental. And that's the time when these battles happen, right? I mean, you mentioned Choturik Rai's essays, and some of them, as you know, came out in Filmfare. I mean, not a journal that you would associate with such debates. And really, two essays. Is there an Indian New Wave? To which his answer seemed to be an emphatic no. And Four and a Quarter, where he talked about four films, and that was the later one, Ankur, Garam Hawa, and one he calls and one of Kumar Shani's. And it's for those two that he reserved his ire. He wasn't terribly complimentary of Bhuvan Shom also. Uh, as you know, he described it in, as he said, in the
Seven
Hollywood way
words.
of 7 words. Yes, big bad bureaucrat, charmed by beautiful village belle. But and Chidananda Dashgupta has actually remarked on this. What people don't take into account is how people then weren't taking into account enough was how much Ray's own work was changing during that time. I mean, he had moved very far from the days of, say, the Opu trilogy, or even films like Debi, etc., Charulata, into Oroneddin Ratri and the city films. There had been Nayok, that fascinating film in between. And in fact, recently on your Dak Bangla, there was a fantastic essay on Nayok by Rachel Dwyer, which I really, really enjoyed reading. But in any case, I mean, I think, as I say in the book, Ray was somehow seen as a historical figure by these new cinema makers, including Mrinal Sen, who's only a couple of years younger than him. And it's almost like, no, he's not a historical figure. He's very much their contemporary. And I think this was a battle among contemporaries. And it's true that some of his position in those essays is it speaks or he comes across as a conservative, which he wasn't. I mean, he himself undertook some of the best cinematic experiments that the country's known. But be that as it may, this was a time, to cut a very long answer short, this was a time when political modernism was forging itself as an aesthetic in India. And there was no script for it. You didn't say, Acha, you reproduce Godard and you have Indian political modernism. Its script was being written out and argued by its Indian makers. And that's what makes this period super exciting.
Okay. So I think this is a very good moment to, do a small reading about your description of a scene from Bhuvan Shom, which is not in Bonpul's original, story, but forms one of the key moments of Sen's movie. So if you could just read us the part about the dreamy sequence in that film between Utpal Datta and Suhasini Mule.
So again, I mean, in that chapter, I was asking the question of what constitutes newness. And I walk the reader through many different criteria of newness. You know, there was newness in funding, there was newness in plots, in particular stylistic features, in adaptations, because a lot of films were being adapted from the Nai Kahani authors. Bonopul, for example, was a little older than some of the Nai Kahani authors, but he hadn't, I mean, he wasn't the go-to person. But then, without giving too much of the chapter away, I actually argue that in order to really understand newness, you have to feel it. There's something about newness that is in the experience of novelty, and that's why I because I've watched Bhuvan Shom God knows how many times now, and that particular scene, which was very important to Manal Babu himself, it really stands out. So let me read it. And again, I don't know how good the transmission is. I don't know if you're having uh, if it's in fits and starts, but here goes.
No, no, it's absolutely fine. Please go ahead.
So the part in the film that I'm talking about, it's also kind of at odds with the rest of the film, because the rest of the film has a sort of satirical, humorous tone. But then this part kind of stands out because it's not that. Shom, Bhuvan Shom, has something of an epiphany during this sequence that has a strange, dreamlike, fabulous quality. Interestingly, this sequence was Sen's improvisation and is absent in Bonapul's original story. Gauri, played by Suhashini Mule, dresses Shom up as a Western Indian villager. A short kurta, churidar, a big turban, and a stick, sufficiently scruffy so as not to alert the birds that there is a stranger in their midst. They will head over to the Bhoot Bangla, she tells him, a prime site to spot birds. We see the two figures, Gauri and Shom, in a long shot, running on a dazzling, empty expanse of rocky sand, his gun effortlessly perched on her shoulder. Shom quizzically inquires where she's taking him, as there is a cut to a darker, shadowy, uneven terrain with a ramshackle house in the background. Gauri and Shom appear in the foreground, their backs to us, as they make their way nimbly towards the building. We hear their excited voices against the sound of the wind blowing in the empty landscape. Once they are inside the building, the sound of the wind is punctuated by a musical bird call. As the two enter a room, Shom asks Gauri about the place. It used to belong to a king, she tells him, but is now an abandoned, haunted house. Fantastic, mutters Shom in English, completely transfixed by the strange beauty of his surroundings, as Gauri launches into a tale she has heard from her father. The king came here to escape from the extreme heat of the land, she tells him. The house would never be hot, as a cool breeze always wafted through its rich, tall interiors. We catch a glimpse of a body of water in the background as the soundtrack switches to classical music. Gauri comes into focus again, this time framed against the window, beyond which is the body of water. Pointing to two empty hooks on the ceiling, Gauri tells Shom that there used to be a swing that hung there on which sat the queen. This is the moment that is reminiscent of the swing sequence in Shotajit Rai's Charulata, except Gauri is not the immaculate Charu. She's dusty and bedraggled, as rural women used to manual labor are. In a rapid short reverse shot, we see her through Shom's eyes as he imagines her as the queen. The soundtrack is now playing a song that commemorates the mythic figure of Radha on a swing with her female playmates. As dusk comes, the king joins his queen and regales her with stories, tales of foreign lands, of battle and hunting, until she falls asleep. We don't see Gauri's face as she narrates this account to a rapt Shom. The lower quarter of her lenga clad body, pacing up and down, is visible in the frame. The mirror work on the garment, twinkling in the sunlight pouring in through the latticed architecture of the walls. Suddenly, she interrupts her narrative, and we see her face once again as she nimbly runs over to a veranda and points towards something on the horizon. As Shom trains his binoculars to where she's pointing, the background musical score changes into a medium paced instrumental melody, and we see the birds. A pat of flamingos over which fly a wedge of swans. Shom and Gauri gaze eagerly, passing the binocular between each other with a familiarity that is intimate. As most of the birds fly off, she suggests they run to a sand dune close by to keep looking. The magic spell of the 4.5 minute long sequence is broken, and we run and we return to Shom's hunting quest. But really, that sequence and the way the actors as well as Mrinal Sen reminisces the way it came about. They were in Saurashtra, they met with the Raja of Bhavnagar, and he had said to them that, oh, there's a spot, there's this little water body where you can see all of these floods. And then, according to Mrinal Sen, it was Utpal Datto who met with the chowkidar of the Haveli, who told them these stories. And he works it into the narrative of the film. It wasn't in the Bonapul original. And it's also a weird moment. It's the one moment in the film where intimacy is suggested, right? I mean, a kind of eroticism between Shom and Gauri, which Sen himself is a little uncomfortable to even play up. But it was there, latent. I mean, there are so many things that are happening in that moment. But that's where you feel something that you can't quite put into words. And that's when Bhuvan Shom, the character played by Utpal Datto, sort of undergoes a transformation. So much so that the big bad bureaucrat goes back and decides to not fire, but reward a corrupt functionary, because who was he after all? Jadav Patel was Gauri's husband.
Husband, yeah.
Tatu Meher. I mean, he was another debutant, and he gets promoted. So it's this thing of, well, what leads to the change of heart? And the answer is in that 4 minute sequence. So,
Wonderful. Yeah. So these were the films, and then you have the viewers, the serious viewers, the students of cinema who are watching these films. And the next part of your book takes us through that aspect of the whole art film movement, which is the film societies. And as you mentioned, it's Chidananda Dasgupta's centenary year, and of course, it is Satyajit Ray's centenary year as well. And while these were the the big figures in this whole story of cinema societies, there again are interesting people like Ram Haldar, who was the owner of Kamalayalaya stores, and he was a prominent member. And at some point, he was even offered the role of being the head of the National Archives. So, again, these
yes.
curious figures who walk through the story of art cinema makes it a very interesting part of the book. But what I'd like to talk to you about is these cinema societies. In fact, we have a question or a comment from somebody called Ram Prasad, who says, is there a non-art cinema? And so that was a question that in a way speaks about how by definition these cinema societies looked at mainstream cinema and their song and dance routines and their stories as less than art. So can you just talk us through
Mhm.
this part of your book?
So, thanks for this. So the question was, what is there a non art? What?
So were these film societies actually putting films of the Ghotoks and Sens and Rays at a certain pedestal, and thereby the corollary was rest of cinema was less than acceptable to them?
Okay. Okay. So,
And in fact, in one scene, sorry to interrupt, you also mentioned that people like Tapan Sinha, Torun Majumdar too kind of did not make the cut according to these arbiters of what is art cinema.
right now, again, as a historian, I was trying to capture a certain moment in the film history of our country. And I mean, I should also say that the way I got into this project was actually through the film societies, because initially I wanted to see how cinema became accepted as a serious pursuit in our country. I mean, let's face it, cinema is it's a mass medium, and given that we're a democracy, we have to engage with the medium that engages the masses the most. I mean, and this is digressing a little bit, but often when I was in college, you would find my teachers, historians, all of them, I mean, they watched films, but somehow, um, it wasn't an object. For many of them also, it wasn't an object of study. In fact, in an article that I like very, very much on a very famous song sequence in Hindi cinema, its author actually says that he doesn't know much about the film in which the song belonged. He only writes about the song. So I was interested in understanding that how did that change? Or were there people that actually took film seriously? And that's where the story of film societies presented itself to me. And when I began the research in 2011, 2012, I traveled a lot across to many different parts of India. And I still think that there are people I haven't mentioned in the book. I still come across people every day. And really, this chapter is a tribute to all of them. Some of whom I've named, some of whom I haven't been able to because I'm still discovering them. But having said all that, let me also say that this commercial art divide it's an artificial one. And it's true that often polemically people invoke that, but we have to remember that Shotajit Rai was a huge fan of Hollywood. I mean, he writes in our films, their films, that in the time that I was in Shantiniketan, Citizen Kane came and went, and what a loss that was. I mean, he he was I mean, Mrinal Sen wrote a book on Chaplin. So these divisions in some ways are artificial. I mean, if you read Ray's article on Indian film music, he actually says that I mean, he compliments the tremendous creativity and fusion that you see in Bombay film music. It wasn't called Bollywood, but in Bombay film music. But yes, it's true that there was an element of disdain, and that carried over into, say, the next generation of filmmakers too, about the compulsory song and dance sequences and fight sequences and bhakti type sequences. And they wanted to define a film, or wanted to forge a film culture that was not going to be that. Adur Gopalakrishnan, for example, talks very, he defines his own craft sort of in contradistinction to all of these features. Now, whether that's right or wrong is not something that is my project. I think scholars before me have shown how fallacious that idea is, and how popular cinema itself is a very important object of study. What interested me was actually the zeal and passion with which people studied film, or first of all procured films,
That's
non-Indian
fascinating, of course.
films. And this was the Cold War period. I mean, I've narrated some stories there of how Nazarene came to Kolkata, and there are many such stories. So procuring them, watching them, and mind you, this was not the time of streaming services where you can stop, rewatch just very easily. You knew that you were watching these films perhaps for the only time in your life, because this was a period of tremendous scarcity, right? But to watch films in a period of scarcity without, without in any way making yourself abject, like watching them, getting a handle on them, and then regarding yourself as experts who can talk about them intelligently. So that's what the story of film societies is in some ways, forging a certain high culture, if you will, even though your economic conditions don't permit that, but without any feeling of abjectness. And there, I mean, just think about the kind of films that they brought to India. So there was, of course, the neorealist stuff from Italy, but subsequent to that, they are the first ones really to introduce the Japanese, the Eastern Europeans, eventually Iranian, the Latin American new waves, or Yugoslav, all of that to sort of the public sphere in India. And I find that fascinating. I mean, yes, there was a kind of highbrowism, but it's a fascinating story. And I mean, I want to end this with an anecdote. A good friend of mine and senior colleague and teacher, Ashish Rajatyaksh, has recently completed a very interesting book on the FDII. And, there's one slogan that he cites in that book, and it goes something like, Eisenstein, Pudovkin, we will win, we will win. And you realize how these messages sort of have encrusted themselves in our consciousness, and how they were activated in the 1950s and 60s, and they're still important to this day. And if you ask me who contributed to that kind of oppositional thinking and consciousness, it would be the films. That would be my response.
Wonderful. You just, when we go to the second half of the book, you in detail describe aspects of Ritik Ghotuk's films, Sen's films, and Shotyajit Ray's films, uh, each from a certain and a very particular lens. You mentioned music in cinema, in popular cinema, as being a point of divergence where most people say, okay, what has music is not acceptable as serious cinema. Yet you have in your portion on Ritik Ghotuk, whose birthday is on 4th November, you have written beautifully about his use of song, music, and poetry in three of his films. So if you can just briefly tell us about that before we start taking questions.
Yeah, and actually, I don't. I mean, again, to the viewer who asked the question about non-art, one thing I should also underscore here is that initially in the Film Society movement, they neglected things like silent films. But as the thing, as the Film Society movement continued, it really became the forum for watching all kinds of films, documentaries, things that were censored, silent films, so all of that. So the category art and non-art, I think, they're elastic, and we have to think about them contextually. I just wanted to make that point. But coming to music, I mean, and again, there are others who have commented on the the song sequences in Ritik Ghotok. Monishita Dash recently has written about Meghe Dhaka Tara. She's just published a volume from the British Film Institute on that particular film, Meghe Dhaka Tara. And one of the things that I've always found really interesting is that even though art filmmakers define themselves, or these filmmakers often define themselves by critiquing the role of song in films, it's really interesting to see how many songs so many of their films have. I mean, their films are actually full of music, full of music. And in Ritik Ghotok in particular, I was making the argument over there that because to me these filmmakers are interesting as filmmakers, but really I go to them because I see them as historians who are working with the medium of cinema. And and each one, I argue, is doing it differently. And in Ghotok, I say that it's in the song sequence that you actually get a completely different sense of historical time than you do in the rest of the film's narrative. So if you take a film like Meghe Dhaka Tara, which is really the story of a refugee family, and the way in which it kind of sucks life out of of the daughter, the older daughter, played by
Yeah.
Shubhra Chaudhary. And it's a kind of relentless film of how little by little it's a march of death in some ways in that film. The time that it's in the song sequences that you get a completely different opening into other horizons of what could have been. So I have a discussion of Jirate Morduarguli as well as um, the Uma Shongit in the film. And it's almost like a left leaning Marxist filmmaker was imagining post colonial temporality as constituted by gods and spirits, as containing multiple life worlds within it. And that's not the narrative thrust of the filmic, of the film story. I was trying to say that song times, and I use that word in the book, that song times actually give us a completely different sense of time than the narrative time of the film. And ultimately, I think this experiment or this holding two or more kinds of temporal sensibilities together, this is ultimately what historians do. They try to, when we talk about, well, how do we think about the different times that we as Indian inhabit? I mean, there are many different senses of time. There's developmental time, there's the time of gods, there's the time of spirits, there's office time, there's this time, that time. And in Ghotuk's films, I try to demonstrate that experiment with temporality by focusing on the song sequence. And I argue that the songs are sort of fundamental to his structuring of the film.
Okay. So, while that is the aspect you've spoken about in Ritik Hotuk's film, you've also mentioned that there are parts. I mean, he wasn't obviously famously so regarded as significantly in his lifetime as he was posthumously. So how would you have at various points in your book spoken about the relation of his cinema to partition, and how many other critics too see his complete focus on that historical moment as unique among filmmakers because it informed so much of his filmography. So, as a historian, how would you like to assess? I mean, this is obviously an answer that can go on and on. Ghotuk's engagement with that particular moment in history.
Again, I mean, I think there are many Ghotuk specialists uh, the world over now. I mean, certainly in Kolkata, who can speak to this far better than I can. I mean, they've they've looked at all of his work. They've probably looked at. I mean, I've read some of his short stories, and it's sort of received wisdom on Ghotuk that I run with in the book. I mean, Bhaskar Sharkar has a very good book in which on the cinemas of partition, and he actually devoted a chapter there to Ghotuk's trilogy. Moinak Bishas has written about it. Monishita Dash has written about it. There are many. Actually, in Kolkata, there are. Sanjay Mukhopadhyay has been talking about this for a long time. I mean, Ashish Rajadhokko. Now, why the preoccupation with partition? That's a difficult question to answer. But as he famously says in one of his interviews, I think around Komal Gandhar, he says that, look, I'm not a politician. I cannot talk about how you can bring together places that have been sort of torn asunder. But at the same time, I want to speak about the theme of unity. And that's why in Komal Gandhar, he says that from time to time, he uses marriage songs that play, old marriage songs that play in the background. And he says that as a cultural worker, I can only speak to these different, to the thematics of unity as it manifests in, and he specifically talks about Bengali culture. He's not purporting to talk about the other province that was partitioned. It's not a reference to the partition of Punjab over in 1947. His focus is Bengal, and he weaves in uh, different cultural elements into that and forges an imagination, because I think I mean, the partition of the two provinces left him feeling bereft. And even as I say it, I realize that this is a history he lived through in a way that I didn't, and subsequent generations don't. So I can only narrate it with empathy, in a manner of speaking. It's not my history. That said, I do want to insert a footnote. Recently, there's a scholar who um, works at the University of St. Andrews, and she made a very interesting. Actually, she has a piece um, on Bari Theke Paliye, and she said that perhaps if we watch these other Ghotok films, Nagorik and Bari Theke Paliye, maybe we'll also start to think about him as a filmmaker of something other than Partition. And Ajantrik also, I think, is one of the films that she writes about there. And I was really struck by that. I mean, it's a piece that I came across after the book was out. But her name is Shongita Shen, and I hope she'll develop it further, because I thought it was a very interesting take on Ghotok.
Okay. We have a slew of questions, which is what I'm looking at on the side. One is, how and why did you choose? Shumona Bose is asked, how and why did you choose these three pioneers, Shotajitra, Ritik Ghotok, and Mrinal Sen, to detail and analyze in your book? So let me just add that Sen's City trilogy and Shotajitra Calcutta trilogy, again his City trilogy, are the areas of focus in Rochona's examination of these two directors. So, what made you choose these three directors?
So again, this book is not an exhaustive analysis of every single film made by even these three filmmakers, which would actually easily, if you took their documentaries, unreleased films, it would go up to over 100. My interest in them was really from the point of view of a historian, what they were telling us, not just about Indian history, but how they were crafting history in ways that historians up until that point hadn't. So, this is really a historian's intervention into film, making the argument that historians have a lot to learn from film in terms of how they craft their histories. And there I found these three to be remarkable. If I'm right, you can probably carry out this exercise with other filmmakers. But really, my point was about historical method and what these historians through cinema were telling us about the post colonial nation. And that's why I went to that.
Okay. There is Shubhankar Bhattacharya, who firstly remembers you. Rochonadi, congratulations on your recent book. I vividly remember you coming to present your research on Shotajitra in Oxford in 2013. And then he has a few questions, of which I will choose the one. Where do you see the art house cinema legacy today, particularly in Bengal? Ray Ghotok and Mrinal Sen were succeeded by Gautam Ghosh, Apurna Sen, and Buddhadev Dasgupta. So, what are your thoughts on that? Where is the art house cinema legacy today? You have touched upon it in a broader way in your conclusion.
So, thank you, Shubhankar, and thank you for remembering and also coming to the session. One thing I should say is, to say art house in the context of Indian cinema sounds, it's a bit of a misnomer, because, I mean, think about it. How many art houses do we have? We have our one Nondon in Kolkata, right? I mean, so in that sense, I give some figures in the book that it's somewhere in the introduction. I won't be able to find it now. That at a time when I think America had something over 100, we didn't. So, oh, here, I found it. So, one of the first and few art house theatres, Nondon, was established in Calcutta as late as 1985 38 years after independence. As a point of comparison, by 1950, there were 80 such theaters in America that rose to 450 by 1963. So, this gives you a sense of the differences that we're talking about. When I said economy of scarcity, it's not just scarcity in films, but it also in art houses. We didn't have dedicated places to watch films. So we watched them in embassies, in colleges, in schools, in people's houses, in attics, wherever we could. Sometimes crowdsourced in open fields. Yes, there was a very robust alternative film movement, and all the names you mentioned and more. I mean, you can go to Kerala, you can go to Karnataka, Assam. There are many, many very important filmmakers who themselves have identified as their genealogy some of the people that I write about in this book, that is Ray Kotokshy. But I also think that it speaks to the success of the movement that they unleashed, the art cinema movement, that these films have become a part of our filmic inheritance in ways that even people that you wouldn't associate with art cinema. See, someone like Vidhu Vinod Chopra, he would also regard these very much as, say, his inheritance. I mean, Kolkata filmmakers, contemporary filmmakers, Srijit Mukherjee, he would identify these as part of his filmic inheritance and many more. And I should also say, and I don't know if this is true of you, Mala, when we were growing up, we watched everything, right? I mean,
Absolutely. Yes.
it's not just, I mean, these films, it wasn't just what you found at Presidency College, Chalachitra Shaushad, but also Amar Akbar Antony. Also, I mean, Bazigar, everything. And
Every,
really, uh, the division between art and commercial for me works as a heuristic. It's interesting to think of them as separate analytical categories, to also understand how people exercise the function of it. So, and as to where the art house film movement is now, I think it's a very dispersed theme, very, very dispersed theme, as particularly, with the digital done. But I heard a very interesting talk yesterday by Lalita Gopal, and I'll just stop with that, where she made this very interesting comment where she said that, with the digital, you think that you have everything, and yet things are ever so difficult to find. I mean, everything is out there supposedly, but really not there, right? I mean, how many of the festival films do we end up watching? How many of them
absolutely.
are really available to us? So I think, yes, it's had a long afterlife. It's not what I deal with. It's a longer conversation, but I'll just stop with that. Yeah.
Yes, so you mentioned in your last answer that I think a good part to stop with is to quote from Rajadhyaksh, who you mentioned while during this session about Rajadhyaksh. You quoted as saying, "The only solution left, it appeared, was to make a film nobody could control." So you call these filmmakers historians, not just this triumvirate, but a lot of other filmmakers, from Adur to Aravindan in Kerala to Kasravalli. You've mentioned several films across, Basu Chatterjee, who worked with Sara Akash. So the book is too extensive to really encapsulate in a conversation like this. But I thought the cult root is something that finally was is what has made this strand of cinema in India live on. So if you have an Albert Pinto ko Gussa Kyun Aata Hai in the 70s, that title is echoed in a film made in the last couple of years. And as you mentioned, Srijit Mukherjee, for instance, often references films from Ray's films in his films. So the film does live on as a legacy. So if you had to, I mean, as a final word in this session, if you had to say what do you think the new OTT rage that's happening? You have platforms like Mubi. Do you think these do provide a new outlet for our current filmmakers to then become historians of this period of disorientation brought about by pandemics and climate change and so on?
Well, that's that wasn't, in some ways, that wasn't the brief I set myself in the book. But as I was concluding the book, I did, one of the things I touched on was, well, why would we go back to these things now? And the answer is you said it very nicely, that I think the people I write about trying to live, were trying to negotiate their own times and the challenges and disorientations thrown up, or the feeling of disorientation thrown up by their own times. And the films, in some ways, are a script of how to live and live well and responsibly and ethically at a particular historical moment. And that's the note in which I end, that we are, I mean, talk about disorienting times. I think the very fact that we're having this conversation in the format that we're having it in
Absolutely.
feels almost normalized, right? I mean, and right now, if you ask how, what do we want everything to go back to what it was. I mean, so it's a peculiar kind of historical thinking where we're all looking back to the past that was 2 years ago. And there, yes, I think films do have, I mean, they are giving us scripts of living through this present. I don't think I have enough of a handle on the fast and furious rate of production that's going on to talk knowledgeably. But let me end on this note by saying that on the one hand, there is a phenomenal amount of good, challenging film work that's going on. What I fear, and maybe because I'm a middle-aged person, I fear is the loss of community, the face-to-faceness, the watching together. And there, I don't know what it will be like once we come out of these pandemic times. I mean, whether we're just going to be glued to our computers and watching like stream film after film after film, or whether we're going to be able to forge new new communities that will give us new possibilities into the future. But in a hopeful spirit, let me just say that here's looking to new communities through film.
Yes. So thank you so much, Rochona. Thank you for this wonderful session. And hopefully, we will meet at Victoria Memorial at some point. Thank you
So
so
I
much. Have a great day. And to all our audiences, thank you so much for joining us. I wish all of you a great evening and a wonderful festive week ahead. Thank you so much.